30 degrees north latitude, 42 degrees west longitude. The gray Atlantic heaved beneath a low ceiling of mist as Lieutenant Commander William Draw banked his Grumman TBF Avenger into a steep turn. Below, a black shape slid beneath the waves, U-569, beginning her desperate dive. He had 90 seconds. The ocean erupted in white plumes as two depth charges found their mark, and within minutes the submarine's oil spread like ink across the water. From the deck of USS Bogue, sailors watched the slick widen, a small victory in a war of attrition measured in tons, miles, and lives. That moment, on the 22nd of May 1943, would mark the turning of the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. The escort carrier, a ship derided as too slow, too fragile, too small to matter, had just proven itself decisive. In the empty expanse once called the Mid-Atlantic Gap, air cover had finally arrived, and with it, a new kind of warfare. The hunters were about to become the hunted. What had begun as a desperate experiment would soon rewrite the doctrines of naval power. How did these humble vessels, the escort carriers, close the gap, break the wolfpacks, and win the Atlantic? In early 1943, the North Atlantic was dying by the mile. Convoys that once slipped confidently through its gray expanse now crept forward beneath constant threat. In March alone, Admiral Karl Dönitz's U-boats sank 82 merchant ships, nearly 500,000 tons of vital cargo. In the 4 days of battle around convoys, HX-229 and SC-122, 22 ships went down. The Mid-Atlantic Gap, the stretch of ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft, had become a killing ground sailors called the Black Pit. Here, no aircraft patrolled the skies, no destroyers could arrive in time, and submarines surfaced freely to hunt, recharge, and strike again. The Allies were losing the Battle of the Atlantic, not for lack of courage, but for lack of reach. The United States Navy knew the problem. It simply refused the solution. In 1940, the proposal to convert merchant ships into small carriers met open hostility from the Navy's highest ranks. But Franklin Roosevelt saw what his admirals could not. The president understood that the Atlantic battle was not a clash of fleets. It was a war of attrition waged in darkness and fog. On the 21st of December 1940, Roosevelt ordered the conversion of merchant hulls into anti-submarine carriers. The first of these, USS Long Island, looked nothing like a warship. Her flight deck was little more than a wooden plank bolted atop a cargo hull. Yet Long Island proved that aircraft could launch, patrol, and recover from a converted freighter, and in war, proof mattered more than prestige. By 1942, shipyards on the U.S. West Coast were adapting the same merchant hulls into a new class, the Bogue-class escort carriers. Their engines rattled, their flat bottoms rolled viciously in rough seas. USS Bogue was among the first. Commissioned in September 1942 under Captain Giles Short, the ship's first months were plagued by mechanical failures, engines overheating, elevators jamming. Her mission was straightforward, if uninspiring: provide air cover for convoys through the Mid-Atlantic Gap. They sighted periscopes and conning towers, but each time the U-boats dove before attack. Reports from the Bureau of Aeronautics labeled the escort carrier operationally ineffective. Then Admiral Ernest King intervened. He had watched the Royal Navy experiment with a new idea, the hunter-killer group. In May 1943, Bogue received new orders. No more convoy duty, no more waiting for contact. She would form the nucleus of the Navy's first American hunter-killer group, Task Group 21.11, accompanied by 4 destroyers. Her mission: patrol the Central Atlantic, locate and destroy enemy submarines. This shift represented more than a tactical change. It was a revolution in naval thinking. By late April, intelligence intercepts indicated a massive wolfpack forming to attack convoy ONS-5. They caught U-231 on the surface, its crew scrambling to dive. Depth charges erupted astern. It was a small success, but the next day would change everything. What followed on the 22nd of May 1943 was the action that opened this story: the destruction of U-569. It was the proof the Navy needed, the vindication Roosevelt had predicted, and the birth of the hunter-killer doctrine. From that day forward, escort carriers were no longer dismissed as baby flat tops. They were hunters, built not to survive the war, but to end it. The 22nd of May 1943, the day USS Bogue turned the Atlantic upside down. Lieutenant Commander William Draw's Avenger came in low over gray water, engines shaking the airframe, depth charges ready. Below, U-569 fought to dive its ballast tanks screaming as compressed air hissed into steel. 2 cylinders of torpex plunged into the sea, detonating seconds later in twin towers of foam and fire. When the spray cleared, oil spread in a widening stain. The submarine's stern lifted once, then slipped backward into 3,000 feet of ocean. Above them, Draw circled in silence. He had just proved that a converted merchant ship could hunt submarines in the open sea. 47 men escaped the wreck, 21 never surfaced again. That single kill was not just revenge, it was revelation. The hunter-killer group worked. In a matter of hours, it had accomplished what months of convoy escort duty had not. For Karl Dönitz, it was the first crack in a wall that would soon collapse. Within days, the pattern repeated. Bogue's Avengers found U-305 by early June. U-217 and U-118 had been destroyed. In the spring of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reached its breaking point. At the start of May, Dönitz commanded 116 operational submarines, yet the same month would be remembered by German sailors as Black May. 41 U-boats were destroyed, nearly one-third of the fleet at sea. New centimetric radar could spot a periscope or conning tower even in fog and darkness. Lee lights, powerful search lamps, mounted under aircraft wings, turned night into day. Destroyers now carried improved depth-charge throwers and hedgehog mortars that could attack without losing sonar contact. Intelligence officers decrypted Enigma messages fast enough to direct hunter-killer groups toward fresh targets. "The losses are too heavy," his signal to all boats read. "All U-boats are to withdraw from North Atlantic convoy routes." After 3 years of domination, the German submarine offensive was broken in 3 weeks. The hunters had become prey. Through the summer and fall of 1943, Bogue's task group continued its relentless patrols. On June 5, aircraft discovered U-217 refueling from a submarine tanker, releasing depth charges that tore both submarines apart. By December, Task Group 21.11 had sunk 11 submarines and crippled several more. Numbers told a brutal story. In March, Allied losses exceeded 470,000 tons. It was a revolution in the mechanics of war. The escort carrier changed the tempo of the sea. Its 3-man crew pilot, radio man gunner, functioned as an autonomous combat system. At 100 feet, the pressure wave could crush a hull like a tin can. Later, acoustic homing torpedoes replaced guesswork with precision. Each patrol area was divided into sectors. Destroyers raced toward the coordinates, sonar pinging the depths. The submarines faced attack from above and below, trapped between air and steel. Built from cargo hulls, she carried not might but continuity, a permanent watch over the sea. The crews of Bogue lived hard. Their ship rolled endlessly in heavy swells. Pilots landed on a flight deck only 2 feet long, less than the length of a city block on ships that could roll 15 degrees even in calm seas. Yet they flew, again and again, in all weather, with minimal rest. What they lacked in glory they gained in purpose. Every freighter that reached Britain carried not just cargo but the continuation of the Allied war effort. By the end of 1943, the pattern was clear. The Battle of the Atlantic was no longer a defensive fight, it was an offensive campaign of annihilation. Escort carriers multiplied, their names Card, Corps, Block Island, marking a new kind of fleet. From the decks of USS Bogue and her sisters, the Atlantic looked different now, not as a graveyard of ships, but as a battlefield finally under watch. By early 1944, the Atlantic had grown quiet. The convoys still sailed in gray columns, but the hunters were gone. In their place came an army of shipwrights, welders, and factory crews who built the ships that sealed the victory. Among them stood an unlikely architect of naval power, Henry J. Kaiser, a construction magnate who had never built a warship before the war. Kaiser brought the logic of industry to the chaos of war. His shipyards in Vancouver, Washington, turned out Casablanca-class escort carriers at a pace that defied imagination. Using modular construction, prefabricated hull sections welded together like pieces of an enormous machine, his crews reduced build time from 8 months to just 3.5. At peak efficiency, Kaiser's yards launched one escort carrier every 7 days. Each displaced 7,800 tons, made 19 knots, and carried 28 aircraft. They had no armor, no luxury, and no time to rest. But they worked. This was industrial warfare in its purest form, simple ships, built fast and in numbers large enough to drown the enemy. While the Casablanca class sailed to every ocean, the Atlantic campaign evolved into something even greater, a hunt for intelligence itself. On the 4th of June 1944, Task Group 22.3, centered on the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal under Captain Daniel Gallery, located a submerged contact off the coast of West Africa. Destroyers pounded the area with depth charges until a battered U-boat, U-505, burst to the surface. Lieutenant J.G. Albert David and 8 men climbed aboard the smoking submarine, expecting any second to be blown apart by scuttling charges. Working in knee-deep water, they disabled the charges, shut valves, and stopped the flooding. When they emerged, U-505 was theirs intact, afloat and alive. Inside were Enigma machines, codebooks, acoustic torpedoes, and maps of U-boat patrol zones. Today, the submarine rests in the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, a monument to courage, precision, and preparation. While the Atlantic quieted, the Pacific ignited. The same escort carriers that hunted submarines now carried a different burden: invasion support. In North Africa, during Operation Torch, 4 carriers provided air cover for landings. In southern France, during Operation Dragoon, they delivered close air support for advancing troops. USS Charger never left the American coast but trained thousands of naval aviators in carrier landings, freeing combat carriers for war. The ships built to close the mid-Atlantic gap had become indispensable across 2 oceans. Then came the test that would define them forever. The 25th of October 1944, the battle off Samar. 6 escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, Callinan Bay, Kitcoon Bay, Gambier Bay, and Streetlow formed Task Unit 77.4.3, call sign Taffy 3. At dawn, lookouts spotted pagoda masts on the horizon, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers of the Japanese Center Force, led by Yamato. Sprague did not run. He ordered every aircraft launched fighters, torpedo bombers, even planes unarmed for combat. Pilots flew into battle with depth charges intended for submarines, machine guns for ground targets, or nothing at all. Destroyers Johnston and Howell charged battleships, firing 5-inch guns until they were blown apart. Gambier Bay was pounded by cruiser shells and sank with 147 men. Streetlow was struck by a kamikaze, the first organized suicide attack of the war. But the sacrifice was not in vain. Admiral Takeo Kurita, deceived by the ferocity of the defense, withdrew. Naval historians would call it the most gallant action in United States naval history. The escort carriers, born to fight submarines, had stood against battleships and survived. Even after Samar, the work of the hunter-killer groups continued. By war's end, 11 U.S. Atlantic escort carrier task groups had sunk 53 German submarines. By 1944, America had built 151 aircraft carriers, 122 of them escort carriers. Life on a CVE was never easy. Bunks were stacked 3 high, air smelled of diesel and salt. In the North Atlantic, temperatures froze the steel decks. In the Pacific, heat turned compartments into ovens. They called their carriers Kaiser coffins and wore the name with pride. The escort carrier had not just closed the mid-Atlantic gap, it had closed an era. Victory at sea often comes not from guns or armor, but from vision, the ability to see what others cannot. In 1940, few in the United States Navy believed that small, slow escort carriers could change the course of a world war. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt did. A former Assistant Secretary of the Navy himself, Roosevelt understood the nature of modern conflict better than many of his admirals. Presence over punch, one aide later summarized his thinking. Not speed, Not size, but persistence. Roosevelt saw that the Battle of the Atlantic was not a duel of fleets, but a war of logistics. Land-based aircraft could protect the approaches to Newfoundland and Ireland, but the mid-Atlantic gap, that 700-mile no-man's land, remained open. He realized that even a slow ship with 24 aircraft could change the equation if it could be everywhere, all the time. And he was right. What followed was not only a naval triumph, but a lesson in industrial democracy. The United States won the Battle of the Atlantic not merely because it built more ships, but because it built them differently. Roosevelt's gamble on conversion carriers opened the door for Henry Kaiser's revolution in shipbuilding. The result was a fleet that grew faster than the enemy could destroy it. Industrial capacity had become a weapon in itself. The men and women in America's shipyards, the welders, the riveters, the clerks, fought the war as surely as any pilot or sailor. They proved that innovation was not confined to laboratories or admirals' maps. In Britain, where the concept had first taken root, the Royal Navy embraced the lesson with equal zeal. Together, the U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy divided the ocean into coordinated patrol zones. Dönitz's vaunted wolfpacks, once symbols of unstoppable menace, were suddenly hunted down in their own element. The escort carrier and her hunter-killer groups did more than destroy submarines. They broke morale. They demonstrated that technology and persistence could overturn even the most feared weapon of its age. When the Pacific Campaign demanded air support for amphibious invasions at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Leyte, it was the escort carrier. Slow, expendable, persistent, they became floating airfields that followed the army ashore. The Soviets studied the concept for post-war submarine defense. Even Japan, in its final months, converted merchant hulls into makeshift carriers, a grim mirror of the idea Roosevelt had pioneered in peace. Beyond strategy, the victory carried a moral dimension. The Battle of the Atlantic proved that innovation could come from defiance. He had grasped what professional officers missed, that in total war, flexibility and production mattered more than prestige or tradition. His gamble gave Allied sailors the tools they needed to fight back and turn the tide of a war that might otherwise have been lost before D-Day. And yet, in its quiet way, the story of the escort carrier was also a story of humility. These ships were never designed to last. They had no armor, no glory, no promise of survival, but they embodied the democratic spirit of the nation that built them, ordinary people doing extraordinary things with limited means. From the steel mills of Pittsburgh to the flight decks of Bogue and Card, the same truth echoed: power lay not in perfection, but in persistence. By 1945, the U.S. Navy had accepted what Roosevelt had seen 5 years earlier. The escort carrier was no longer a stopgap, it was an institution. Post-war designs like the Commencement Bay class incorporated the lessons of wartime production. The Navy that once mocked baby Flattops now built them purposefully. The world had changed, and so had war. From now on, victory would depend not only on what a nation could fight with, but on what it could build, and how quickly it could build it. The Atlantic was won not by the biggest ships, but by the smallest. By the summer of 1943, the vast gray ocean that had once swallowed convoys had become a graveyard for the hunters themselves. The mid-Atlantic gap, that once hopeless stretch sailors called the Black Pit, had closed. The victory was not a single moment, but a transformation. From fear to control, from defense to dominance. At the heart of that transformation stood the escort carrier. Her role was never glamorous. She was slow, noisy, and rolled so violently in heavy seas that sailors swore she'd turn over on wet grass. Yet she endured because she could do the one thing no other ship could: stay. Stay in the storm. Stay over the convoys. Stay in the gap. The hunter-killer groups, those improbable teams of escort carriers and destroyers, had turned the Atlantic from a killing ground into a corridor of survival. Behind every crate of supplies, every tank and ration bound for Europe, there was a CVE somewhere on the horizon. No admiral could take credit for the courage of a deckhand arming a bomb in sleet or a pilot catching a wire on a 442-foot deck. They fought fatigue, fear, and the indifferent sea. They lived in steel boxes, worked 16-hour shifts without complaint. They fought not for fame, but for each other and for the ships they guarded. By war's end, America had built 151 aircraft carriers. Of these, 122 were escort carriers. 80 served under the U.S. flag, 38 with the Royal Navy. In return, they had sunk 53 German U-boats and more than 30 Japanese submarines. Their numbers told the story of an industrial miracle, a fleet born of necessity, sustained by ingenuity, and justified by results. The victory at sea reshaped the world's understanding of naval warfare. She proved that persistence, coordination, and intelligence could overcome stealth and terror. By 1960, not one remained in active service. Most were scrapped or sold, their missions completed, their purpose fulfilled. The Cold War's anti-submarine task forces were direct descendants of those humble, hunter-killer groups that once roamed the Atlantic. They had done their job too well. The U-boat threat never returned. Even the Soviet Navy, with its hundreds of submarines, never attempted the kind of massed wolfpack campaign. She embodied the fusion of technology and humanity that defined America's war effort. Built by hands that had never held a welding torch before 1940, crewed by sailors who had never seen combat, Roosevelt's gamble had paid off. Democracy could outbuild, outthink, and outlast dictatorship. We flew from a merchant ship with a flight deck nailed on top. We did it anyway. In that quiet defiance lies the essence of the escort carrier and perhaps of the entire Allied war effort. In the final accounting, her legacy was not measured in tonnage or kill counts, but in endurance. She taught the Navy that strength is not always size, that innovation begins where tradition ends. Today, when historians speak of the Battle of the Atlantic, they often name the great convoys the codebreakers of Bletchley Park. But beneath those stories lies the steady heartbeat of a ship class, once mocked as too small to matter. Without her, the Atlantic might never have been crossed, the invasion of Europe might never have sailed, and victory might never have come. In the stillness after battle, when the seas calm and the engines rest, one truth remains. The escort carriers closed the gap, broke the wolf packs, and turned the hunters into the hunted. And in doing so, they not only saved a war, they changed the sea forever. History deserves to be understood, not just remembered. Subscribe to WW2 Truths and tell us in the comments what hidden story or unanswered question about World War II you would like us to explore next.